Acts 17, starting in verse 27. Actually, we'll start in verse 26. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. Actually, you know what? We're going to start in verse 26. Because the verses I said were fantastic, by the way. But we're actually going to back up and catch his point before he talks about God. And God, ready? Now we're going to start preaching, okay? Everything else was free before, now this is going to cost you. And he, God, made from one man, underline verse 26. So this deals directly with racism. If you struggle with being prejudiced against other people, regardless of their color, whatever, I want you to underline this verse. Let this help you. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way towards him and find him, for he is actually not far from each one of us. I remember one of the first moments I ran into the thing what we would stereotypically call racism. I grew up right next to the Chippewa Indian Reservation in Minnesota, and went to an Indian school. And so if you've ever been to the res, you know that there's a lot of hurt there. There's a lot of issues on the res, and not the least of which is interactions among family members. And one of the first moments I remembered was when I was on a bus going to a basketball game, and we went to go visit another reservation to play basketball. And I remember we had to have a cop escort us onto that reservation. And as we were driving, they threw rocks at us, and we had to make sure our windows were closed because things and pieces of all kinds of manner were flying into our bus. And the screaming and yelling and the skin color epitaphs that were coming towards us, which was sadly ironic from the fact that we had Indians on our team. And so what it was anger and hatred toward us, who they had never met. We had never shaken our hands with them. We had never had one conversation, and we were getting abused verbally and some of us physically. When we got off the bus, we had to be escorted from the bus into the school. We couldn't interact with any of the other people there. And after the game, people lined up as we were leaving their gym and were screaming and yelling at us, pointing their finger that they were going to kill us. And I just remember going, what did I do to deserve this? I'm just here to play basketball and not even very good. And I remember from that young age, that was early high school, going, wow, I just came here to play basketball and I feel like I could almost die. Number one, people will experience their race from God. People will experience their race from God. Now we're going to break apart what actual race is. People will experience their race from God. Where do you get your race from? At the beginning of creation, God created Adam in his image, giving him infinite worth. So we've talked about this for the last 3 or 4 weeks. God built Adam. The reason we're humans and not animals is because God built humanity special. We didn't evolve into this mode of humanity. God built us as humans. That's why we're special. We are built in the image of God. Nothing else is like us. It's the reason murder is a big deal for humans, and the death of animals and insects is really not a big deal, especially among the animal and insect world. You don't see insects suing other insects because somebody accidentally died or whatever. There's no justice system in the animal world. Why is that? Because we are created in the image of God. They don't have a spirit the same way we have a spirit. That tells us right and wrong. God then, from Adam, made Eve, and from their union, all other humans came. So look at this. So we just got done seeing Paul speaking of the fact that we all came from one man. Now I want you to turn to Genesis 3. So he's going to actually reference this particular reality in Genesis 3:20. Adam was the first man, Eve, the first woman, taken from Adam, built from his DNA. That's why we are all humans. And look what Adam has to say about Eve in Genesis 3:20. And the man, Adam, called his wife's name Eve because she was mother of what? All the living. So that goes right hand in hand with what Paul said to this mixed crowd of people. From one man, God brought everyone else, even females. God really went against the natural way of building humans, which is men and women get together in a sexual union, and from their union comes a child, but it comes from the female. At the very beginning, the first female actually came from a man. And so Paul makes the point, from one guy, from Adam, came literally every human that's ever been made, even his own wife. And from their union now, all the progeny, here we are, we sit thousands of years later with billions of people on the earth. Why is it still just one humanity? Because it came from just one human. This meant that the race of humans was special and intrinsically different from insects, animals, and fish. Over hundreds of years, millions of people began to populate the earth. So some people wonder, well, if we all came from one man, how can so many people get on the earth? Well, I want you to understand something. At the beginning of creation, there's probably 0 miscarriages. Propagation went well, and there wasn't probably much else to do other than propagate and work in the field. So we didn't have Twitter back in the day. We didn't have time wasters. It was basically like either go to work or make kids or whatever. So, and the fact that some people lived to 800-900 years old, imagine your body not breaking down. Like when we look in the mirror at like 38 and a half, we go, dude, what is going on here? Right? But I mean, if you're living to 800-900 years old, you know, by the time you're 600, 700, you're still looking pretty, hey, I look pretty good for about 758. So what I'm saying is, generations were massive because they lived longer. And so you were able to literally imagine birthday parties with hundreds of kids that are yours, and they invite their friends, which are their relatives. And I've had people ask me this, well, if incest is wrong, then why, how at the beginning of time, then Adam and Eve, their kids would have had to marry one another. Brothers and sisters would have had to marry one another. Yep. Incest wasn't an issue until genetic problems thousands of years later said, hey, you can't marry that close. Actually, in some parts of the United States, that's still an issue, but realize that wasn't an issue. Here, let me help you with that. Understand this. Whoever you got married to, if you're married, or if you're looking to get married, you're marrying a brother or sister. You're not marrying a different race. There's no aliens out there. You're marrying a human. And that means this, that you're marrying a brother or sister, as gross as that may sound, just separated by multiple thousands of generations. You're still marrying inside the family of humanity. But way back here at the beginning, it was a small amount of choices. Sisters or brothers. Now, to us, that seems weird, but understand, Adam had sexual relations with really somebody almost his exact DNA structure when God built Eve. So you can't get closer to someone than if they're built out of your own skin. Is everybody still with me? As freaky as that sounds, understand, whoever you married a brother or sister. It's just that they were separated by thousands of generations of people, but they're still in the family of humanity. At the beginning, there was just very few choices. All right, okay, good. Here, moving on. Like, I never knew that. Yep. Incest wasn't a big deal until thousands of years later when if you married so close to you because of genetic mistakes, God said, don't marry inside your family because that's going to cause children issues. So incest is only an issue thousands of years later, not at the beginning. And even then, you still marry inside your family, inside the family of humanity. After the flood, Noah's flood, which killed almost everybody in the whole world, except for Noah and his family. After the flood at the Tower of Babel, God separated the people, all Adam and Noah's descendants, by diversifying their language. So if you're still in Genesis, turn to Genesis 11. So I've had people ask me, where do all the languages come from? Why is there different skin colors? Actually, the Bible has an answer for that. In Genesis 11, look at Genesis 11, verses 1 through 9. So now, track with me, because I'm going to help you. I'd love to help our whole nation understand the issue of racism and prejudice, but unfortunately, everybody just wants to scream and yell rather than come to an understanding so we can all live in peace. But this is why it matters. If we all literally come from one man, that literally means we're all part of the same family. Everybody still with me? Track with me now. Everybody walk with me. If we literally come from one person, we're all part of the same family. Even if there's billions of us on the earth, we're still part of this one first guy, Adam. But how do we get then Chinese skin color, African skin color, Norwegian skin color, Spanish skin color? Where do all these skin colors come from, and why are there different cultures all the way they are? Bible actually gives an answer for that. Even though we're all of one man, this is how we get there. Genesis 11:1. Now the whole earth had what? One language and the same words. So this is all from Adam. Whatever that original language was, they still speak it thousands of years later. This is after the flood, when people have started to repopulate the earth. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had bricks for stone and bitumen for mortar. So that's kind of like a slime or a viscous type of substance that once it dries, it sticks things together. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heaven, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the whole face of the earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing they propose will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of the earth. And they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the languages of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the whole face of the earth. You want to know why you have to take a language class? And you go, "Gosh, why is French so hard?" Or if you've tried to learn English, I would hate to learn English as a second language. Those of you guys that have learned English as a second language, high five to you. Because some of our rules don't even work, right? I.e. except before W, or after M, or except when it's in the feminine form of the masculine neuter or whatever. I mean, it's crazy to try to learn American English especially. The reason we have to do that is because God himself spread out people all over the earth. And one of the ways he tried to do that was build a tower to heaven. And I want you to see this picture of a ziggurat, which there still are today. This is the one over by Babylon that still stands to this day. And it's an unfinished tower that they were building. And so this is from probably about 3,000 years ago, about 1,000 BC. And this is the idea of how they would build towers back in ancient days, which was the style of the ziggurat. And so what God did was, from this point, from one guy, one language, he split their languages up so they wouldn't all work together for their own arrogance and pride. He wanted people to live all around the world. And and the main way he did that was to give them all separate languages. So now imagine hundreds of thousands of people or 1 million people settling in the valley, and God splits their languages up. You can't speak to one another, and you go, let's just get out of here. So everybody that can speak the same way left. So watch what happens now, is when that people group leave and start to disperse around the earth, they take with them their own gene pool. And now there's segregation of gene pools. So depending on where they end up, now that gene pool is surviving inside of that people group. So there's not a mixing of people groups the way there used to be. So I want you to see the way, here's a picture of how they may have dispersed around the world. You see in the middle there is Babylon, and it looks like they spread out all around the world like this. The Ice Age happened at that point, and they could have crossed the Bering Strait into North America. And so I want you to realize we can get people all around the earth from one spot if they understand each other's languages, and with that they pull their own cultures. And I also want you to see, look at how we get to different colors of skin. This is the picture of the world. Look at that. Isn't that odd? This is the melanin in your skin. So regardless of what skin color, skin tone you have, you are of the same person, Adam, but once people start to settle in an area and their gene pools stay there, understand that as people get darker, it's usually in the hotter climates. If you're pasty white like me, you usually live north or extreme south. That's just the reality of genetics. That's how you end up with the skin colors you have. And across the world, this is about how the skin tones are from top to bottom. So, you can still come from one guy, but you can get a multitude of different skin tones. After Babel, isn't that interesting? We have a word called Babel. You know what babies do? Babble. You want to know why we call it their language Babel? Because we don't understand them. Oh, cute. What are you saying? Little Johnny's babbling. Our English word babble comes from this moment where God confused the languages of the world, so they babbled to one another and they didn't understand. So everybody that understood the same language, that people group left. And wherever they went, their gene pool stayed with that people group. But they're still the same person, Adam. While we may have different skin color, we are of what? We are of one blood. You know the difference you can tell human blood from animal blood or whatever is because you have a certain genetic DNA that's built from God. You're human. So here's what that means. There's only one race, the human race. Everybody with me? Okay. This is huge. I made this whole point because I want you to realize this. If you hate somebody because of their color, or if you're prejudiced against someone because of their color, I want you to understand you're stupid. Let me help you. Okay? If you're like, I wonder if I'm stupid, you're stupid. If that's your only reason for not liking someone is because of the skin tone, what you don't realize is that they're of your family. We are of one blood. There's the reason and here's the point. Racism isn't a thing. What you're experiencing is prejudice. Because there is only one race. We come from the same race. The only way a thing or a person could be racist is if they came from like Mars. And they came to visit the earth and they go, look at this race of human. I hate them. I'm going back to Mars. Then you could say that one alien is racist because we're all of one race. Is everybody still with me? I want you to understand, racism is not a thing. Regardless of what you see on your Facebook feed or what you've been told, there's only one race. What you experience is prejudice. And that's what's wrong. And that's what's sinful. And that's what's evil. So how do we work our way away from that? I'm glad you asked.
Pastor Robert, I'm the discipleship pastor here at Orchard Church, and I get to bring to you the second point. People don't experience racism, but rather prejudice. People don't experience racism, but rather prejudice. Our culture defines racism as a term that artificially separates people and has an arbitrary standards. You see that in our everyday culture. You see it on TV, where the differences of people are exposed for all of us to look at. You see it a lot on Facebook. Go through your Facebook page. You see all different perspectives of people, their opinion on whatever's going on, and the differences we have with each other. You see it throughout our society, and you even in the last few years see it as it relates to police officers and a decision an officer makes and just how people view that decision, right or wrong. Everybody has an opinion based upon race. Because there is only one race, there is no such thing as racism, but prejudice, or prejudging people before they are known. Prejudice based on ethnicity has destroyed countless lives through history. Key point, people don't have a racism problem evident by skin color. People have a sin problem evidenced by prejudice. Let's take a look at what that looks like. Our first slide here. This is a statement from a particular person most of us are familiar with. It says, "If I am ever really in power, the destruction of the Jews will be my first and most important job. As soon as I have power, I shall have gallows erected, as many of them as traffic allows. Then the Jews will be hanged one after another, and they will stay hanging until they stink. Exactly the same procedure will be followed in other cities until Germany is cleansed of the last Jew," Adolf Hitler. That statement in and of itself would be profound and just makes your heart break. But it just didn't end with the statement. It resulted in this action here. Picture. We hear about it. We know about it. That's prejudice. That's the result of being prejudiced. Many years before that, in our own country, we had prejudice existed when slaves were brought over to this country. We had slavery, and many of us know that in President Lincoln in 1863 wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, which allowed slaves to be free. But that didn't happen for over 101 years. You see, slavery, blacks brought over to this country were property. They were owned by other people. They weren't treated as human. They're actually counted as half a human at one point. And so 101 years later, we have the Civil Rights Movement. And there was a man by the name of Martin Luther King that many of us are familiar with. And here's a statement that Martin Luther King made. "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Martin Luther King. Right about that time, the Civil Rights Movement was in full bore. We have a picture of a girl named Ruby, who in about 1965 was one of the first girls at 6 years old, 1960, that went to a school that had previously been segregated and had to be escorted by U.S. Marshals for her to go to school. In her terms, she went to school with all these people, with all these signs, and she thought it was a parade. She had no idea what was really going on. And this is when segregation and educational system begin to change. And our next picture shows what happens, because one of the marshals that was with her, that's the marshal that escorted her. She's 58 in that picture. He's 91. And they reunited. And so neither one of them really understood prejudice, understood racism from their part. But our society, all these things begin to happen here in our own country when it comes to prejudice. That's what prejudice does. For me, the idea of prejudice hits home. I had the opportunity 10 years ago to take a look at my background and where I'm from. So my whole family began to take a look at where we originated from both of our parents. And so last year, in about March of 2016, I did a DNA test, and my sister did a DNA test, and we went through Ancestry.com. And so my mother's side was done through the DNA test for my sister. We did a swab, put it in a kit, sent it back to the company. I did a swab for my father's side and sent it back to the company, and this is what it shows. So 58% of my genetics from my father's side is from Africa, 18% from Asia, 18% from Europe, and a little bit of Polynesian and Native American. On my mother's side, there's much more Native American on her side. And so you see the origins of Congo and Libya and certain parts of the western part of Africa is where my dad was from. My mom is from the western side of Africa. But you see in that genetic makeup from that DNA that my background extends all the way back to the three sons of Noah. If you do your research and you trace back how they all came, what Pastor Jim says, we all come from Noah and by way of Noah from Adam. I want to show you the next picture because that DNA means something and is imputed in people. That's my family. So I've talked about my dad. There's my mom. You have my oldest sister, Arville. You see her on the left. She's 4 years older than me. My sister, Joy, is 2 years older than me. That's me. And then the right, 6 years later, my parents had an accident. My brother was born, Darian. Actually, the story is when I was 6 years old, I prayed for a brother. My dad was overseas, and I had a mom and two sisters. I had all girls in my family, and I couldn't deal with it. I told you this before. So I prayed for a brother, so God answers prayers. And my brother came, and then my dad came home, and then we were a happy family after that. But you even notice that in the picture on the right, you see me not looking at it because most people that know me know I don't like taking pictures. That must be a genetics thing because it's been that way since my entire life. But that's my family. So my dad himself experienced prejudice. My mom, my sisters. My dad, when he was 18, first semester of his senior year, he graduated from high school in 1949 and joined the Navy. He passed away a few years ago, and I read his DD-214s and his history, his medical history, and everything about his life in the Navy. He never talked about this to me, but I read about this after he had died and passed away. And it said in 1949, he joined the Negro Navy. Military was segregated back then. Even though many years before they talked about changing that, it wasn't until 1949 to 1950 that an executive order came from the president to desegregate the military. And his information says that he went from the Negro Navy to the regular U.S. Navy. In 1950, he was enlisted into the regular U.S. Navy. So it impacted him. My mom, through her education experience, experienced prejudice. My oldest sister, 1965, we are all from San Diego. We were part of the San Diego Unified School District. The San Diego Unified School District in 1965 started a program called VEEP, Volunteer Exchange Education Program, where kids that went to predominantly African American schools were allowed to actually legally go to a school in another community. My sister in 1965, as a 7th grader, went to a school called Woodrow Wilson Junior High School. I didn't know through all my life until this past summer at a family reunion she shared with some of my cousins that she experienced extreme forms of prejudice, so much that it affects her life today. That's how deep it is in my family. I never experienced any of that. 4 years later, I went to the same junior high school and was elected as 7th grade commissioner. All white school, everybody on the student government was all white but me. But I never experienced and had the feelings my sister went through. High school, same thing. Assistant Commissioner General after my first year. Never was personally exposed to prejudice. Never saw it. Other blacks did, but I didn't. And I just didn't have that experience of seeing that. You see here in the next slide, after college, I went to law enforcement. And there you would expect a lot to happen. I experienced a lot of people that didn't like police officers. So when you talk about prejudice, it's not just race, it's a lot of different things. My first experience of understanding prejudice happened when I arrested a lot of people that I grew up with. One of the stations that I worked at in law enforcement was in the community that I grew up. And a lot of my friends that were in Boy Scout with me and went to school with me, I had to take them to jail for crimes they committed. But there were others that I didn't know, and they would ask me, Or they would say to me, "You're just arresting me because I'm black." I'm like, what's wrong with this picture? See, it wasn't the skin that they were looking at. They were looking at the uniform, the authority figure arresting them. Yet to this day, at 27 years of law enforcement, I never had one white person say, "You're arresting me because I'm white." Because it wasn't a race issue. It wasn't a prejudice of skin color. It's always about the uniform. Even today, people target people in the uniform for something someone else did. That's prejudice on that particular culture in that particular community. But yet, I mentioned growing up, I didn't experience a lot of seeing it. I didn't see a lot of it. I knew other people that did. My first experience with prejudice happened in 1993. My wife and I and my daughter and my son, we lived in Rancho Bernardo area in San Diego. And we were all eating pizza in Graziano Pizza near Rancho Bernardo High School. And during that time, my son was 4. He was hyper, and he was just all over the place. So I took him out for a walk. We walked through the parking lot where the pizza place was, and there was a police storefront where community outreach happens. And I used to work in a storefront in Southeast San Diego. So I was showing my son, here's a police station, here's what we do and all this. He's 4 years old, not really understanding a lot of what I'm saying, but looking at it, spending time with me. And all of a sudden in the background, I hear a voice. "You don't belong here. You don't belong here." And I remember thinking, this is public property. I'm still thinking, not that way. So I look in the window and I see a reflection of a white male, about 6'2" to 6'4", about 235 pounds. Didn't know at the time he was only 16 years old. He looked 18, 20, 22 years old. But he said, "Your people don't belong here." And so those words didn't really have an impact on me as much as I began to say, here my 4-year-old son has experienced prejudice in his life, and this is my first real overt experience of racism and prejudice in my life. And I didn't feel bad for me, but I felt bad for my son's exposure. And there was a very physical confrontation. He got in my face, and I had to use some of the skills that I have in talking him down. And if my son wasn't there, I don't know. But let me go into my wife's prejudice. My wife is prejudiced over colors that don't match. Okay. I had a blue fanny pack. And that's what I carried my gun in. And that particular day, around the corner, there's a store called Ralph's. In the parking lot, I had my fanny pack on. We were going to go out to dinner. My wife says, "You're not wearing that." And so one of the few times I listened to my wife, I decided not to wear it. Had I had it on, I may not be standing here today. I may have exposed my son to my father shooting somebody if it got physical. This guy's way bigger than I was. And that would have been traumatic to my son. The irony of it all is that 16-year-old, I had arrested him when he was 14. Didn't recognize him. A few months later, he got arrested again. I got a call from other detectives to come in, saw him. Him and his 14-year-old brother was in a holding cell. And I just walked by and looked at him, and we record everything. And so I heard him say, "You know who that is? That's Keach. He remembers what you did." Younger brother telling the older brother who did what he did to me. Several years after that, he got arrested. He got arrested for raping a white female, 25 years old, at knife point. But here's the thing. He raped the 25-year-old white female at knife point because her boyfriend was black. So I had to go to court and testify on not just the assault and with the weapon, but his history of being prejudiced. He was a skinhead. So I had to testify of my experience, and he ended up getting somewhere between 15 and 20 years in prison because of the choices that he made. That's how it impacts me. That's prejudice. Prejudice can be helpful when used to navigate life for safety and godliness by avoiding things or people. Prejudice is bad and sinful if it's used to hurt others in hate or selfishness. So sometimes a prejudice can be good. What's an example of that? How could that be? Well, if you're going down an alley and you see somebody with a knife or a gun, you go the other way. Most of you call that common sense. But what you've done is you prejudge the situation. That's okay. It's when you do it to people and cultures that it becomes a sin and shameful. The key point that you see here is Christians are messengers of reconciliation from God who loves people regardless. I ask that you turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 18. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 18. Paul to the Corinthian church writes these words regarding reconciliation. He says, all this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. Therefore, verse 20, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. One of the greatest moments in my life was going to a Promise Keeper in the 1990s at the Coliseum. And a message was preached on reconciliation, and being there with my two brother-in-laws and having white men come to me crying and hugging me, asking for forgiveness of sins where they were prejudiced in their life. You also had other blacks coming to me, and I'm like, well, why are you coming to me? Because blacks discriminated against other blacks. Maybe because one was dark-skinned, one was light-skinned. Maybe because one gang member lived in a different area than another. There was sin. Browns to browns, Hispanic gangs. But you had these men all crying and hugging each other because sin can carry a weight on you. And the experience that we have even in your own life sitting here today. There are situations in your life where you have been wrong because of your race, because of prejudice that exists in our society and in our world. You have been wrong. Sometimes you need to be forgiven, and sometimes you need to forgive. Let me end with this. It all boils down to one simple fact. Prejudice is in everyone. The way we look at the world. Prejudice is in everyone. Jesus is the only answer. Amen? Amen.
Lastly, how do we deal with it? Number 3, people should experience respect and love. How can you be a messenger of reconciliation, as Pastor Robert was talking about? That everyone should experience respect and love. Believers should stand against discrimination and injustice, as everyone is family, and no one should be dehumanized. However, the ultimate cure for prejudice and inequality isn't politics, but the presence of Jesus in the heart. You want to know how we heal our nation? Is Jesus needs to transform hearts. We've had a bunch of politics. We've had a bunch of government, but we haven't had a lot of peace. And ultimately, the ultimate answer is that we need to see people the way Jesus sees people, which is through love and respect. Regardless of their skin color, regardless of where they come from, because we're all of the same family. Believers might end up offended, but they shouldn't look to become offended. We live in a culture that's waiting to be offended. Like, I can't wait for somebody to offend me so I can yell about it. This is probably the first time in our history that our cultures look to be offended. Believers shouldn't look to be offended. They should look to be people of grace, because we know that we have offended others, and we need grace and forgiveness as well. The reaction to hate, prejudice, and conflict says more about the offended than the offender. Believers are to live in peace as people of peace. Christians stop sinful prejudice in their own lives by seeing others more important than themselves. So I'm not going to take time to break this apart, but I want you to understand, here's the way you break it in your own life, regardless of what skin color you are. You know, I was a pastor in Pomona for years, and I had kids of every color in downtown. It was the ghetto. And we had white, black, brown, whatever. And the way I taught them to get along wasn't, we don't just pretend colors don't exist, because colors have been given to you by God. You are who you are by God. Don't be ashamed of that. But the way people get along isn't to make up some world where there isn't skin. No, there's skin color, but we appreciate God in other people. I appreciate how God built you, and I love you for that. I don't live in a fantasy world. I live in the real world, but I say to you, I love you no matter what. I love you because God built you. I love you because we're all one family from what God has done. Believers are saved to serve, and we live to love. You'll be amazed how the love of God in you transforms other people's lives. You'll be amazed at what Jesus does in your life can transform the lives of others. How do we move beyond prejudice in this world? Isn't to say it doesn't exist. It exists. But we show the love of Christ inside of us, which other people go, why are you acting like that? And it brings others to the Lord. Because we're at peace, we can help others find peace too.